All right, so once again, thank you for coming to this conference, everyone. We're going to continue now with our second panel titled Imperialism and Resistance under Trump. Trying to shift gear from our whole first panel, focusing domestically on what's going on, and now we're trying to see how the U.S. empire and its effects overseas under Trump. So here on the panel, we have Aminta Sia. She's a Nicaraguan Palestinian geopolitical journalist, translator, and interpreter. Currently reporting for CommonWire, the bulk of her work concerns resistance and alternative modes of development in the global south. We also have Arwa Awan. She teaches political theory at Oberlin College. Her research interests are in the history and political thought, the history of political thought, and in the theories and practices of Marxism and anti-colonial struggles. And then finally, we have Michael Boyd, who has been active in struggles against U.S. imperialism since organizing against the Iraq War in high school as a member of Not in Our Name. He was first pepper sprayed protesting the second Bush inauguration in 2005, and once again was most recently pepper sprayed protesting the attempted execution of Mario Martinez in October. He co-founded preparing to launch Small Acts Books, a radical book distributor. They have their table and books out there, so please check them out. So we'll get right into it. So this question is for all of the panelists, this first one. In the 2024 election, Kamala Harris ran on a promise that the U.S. would have the most lethal military in the world. While Trump bragged about his peacemaking abilities, that he had started no new wars during his first term, Trump's national security strategy even claims that the U.S. should not seek to dominate the world. However, since his inauguration, Trump has not only continued to support the Israeli genocide in Gaza and regional wars of aggression, but also unleashed a new war against Iran, kidnapped the president of Venezuela, and deployed U.S. troops to Nigeria and Ecuador. So, as anti-imperialists, how should we evaluate the Trump doctrine? What is its program for U.S. imperialism, and how does it exist in continuity and rupture of the violence of Biden government's plans?
Hello, thank you so much again for providing this space. I think that right now we're at a really critical moment where we need to be really understanding, particularly the ways in which the Trump administration has been changing, I think, some of the modes of imperialist violence. Typically the United States, or rather even the Euro-American hegemony, they aim to go from regime change to regime control, and now I think what we're seeing on a global scale is total fracturing, making it impossible for the peoples of the global south to fully access their national sovereignty through this fragmentation or even this balkanization. And I think that this is really evidenced in sort of U.S.-Israeli military strategy in the Arab-Iranian region. Obviously, we see this with the onset of the Ramadan War. And it is a war where I think right now it's ushered in so much opportunity, not only for the Arab-Iranian region, but I really do think for all peoples of the global south. And the reason why I say that is because they've been able to have a very successful indigenous military weapons production. And this has to be, truly celebrated. They have, for example, the manufacturing of the Shahed 136 drone, right? This is a drone that cost $4,000 to make. The U.S. Copy of it cost $35,000 to make. Iran's resistance in this current iteration of the war also creates a lot of opportunity, right, in terms of also strengthening the internal logic within the axis negotiations with the Iranian state that negates it, but just, follow the minor rises and then really plummeting declines in the market, and that should really tell us a lot about how we're also, the acts of resistance of closing the Strait of Hormuz really denying sort of this U.S.-Israeli, even Gulf access, a particular kind of capital accumulation, right? And its denying of that, I think, really creates a lot of opportunity. I say this as someone who was I just flew from Cuba 2 days ago. I was reporting there for about, a week. And I came to an interesting conclusion, and that's that the IRGC is doing a lot more for the preservation of Cuban sovereignty, of the Cuban revolutionary process, than even some of these, maybe this is not the nicest way of saying it, but these very cowardly, lukewarm, sort of social democratic states in Latin America that have enthroned Maduro under the bus, right? We have to contextualize that. What we observed in Iran could not have happened if we didn't see the events transpire on January 3rd with now, Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cita Flores. I would essentially deem them as prisoners of war at this point. So I think that the Trump administration it's interesting because it's almost like they have a strategy that's akin to sort of, capitalist mindset is one where it's very short-term, there isn't this long-term planning. And you'll see that in some of his statements too, I think, what was it that he said? That, the war on Iran was only going to last 4 days. And then he switched and said, what, it was like 2 weeks, then a month? The Iranians are ready to give it all. And I think that a lot of us in this room are also in that point too. So this creates tremendous opportunity. I think that in contrast to the Biden administration, where I think that we really observed this elite capture of certain vocabularies or frameworks, right? I think that was also really evidenced in the protests that transpired in the United States in 2020. Now I think everything is sort of an open secret. You can't really hide from it anymore. That's why I think it's great that terms like Epstein Empire are being popularized, right? It's all out. We know who our enemies are, and we know who our allies are, and so I think that we're in this conjuncture where it is more important than ever to be very, very courageous, and I do think that the resistance movements are cognizant of that. And I hope that in these next couple of months, imperialism requires permanent war, these wars of accumulation. They're consistent, but they are unstable. And so we need to see where there are certain pockets of opportunity. And more than anything, I think all of us here are convinced that we know what side we're on, but it's communicating that to others as well.
Sorry. It's great to be here with you all. So my comments sort of follow up on what's been discourse of the liberal order, right? Or any kind of grand moral appeals, which I think is evident also in the war on Iran, which when compared to previous US wars and interventions, hasn't really been couched in any normative framework, right? Compared to Bush speaking about America being this force of good, of some universal values to justify the Iraq War, you don't really see much attempt at legitimization, particularly through any appeals to broader universals. It's sort of very overtly about US interests, right? And so I think there's a Schmittian turn in imperial discourse, by which I mean there's politics is being seen as a battle between various interests rather than being evoked as a force of some moral universal good. The fact that international law isn't being evoked at all, even superficially, I think is notable during this war, and it's part of this wider shift. Now, one of the questions which I think we have to think about is, does a move away from this rules-based liberal order means a declining empire? And part of what's happening here is also perhaps a move away from a more coalitional approach to waging wars in different parts of the world, right? I mean, compared to the Gulf War, which was fought after getting UN authorization, and there was a certain kind of masquerade, right, that was necessary, and getting Arab states on board, etc. And with Iraq, we see Germany and France sort of dissenting, right? But now what you see is really an open, overt war that is launched by US and Israel, right, very explicitly as co-belligerents. And does this indicate a more vulnerable and weakened imperialist strategy when you don't have this wider liberal international order in which you're grounding your imperialist strategy? So those are some of the questions I'd like to put on the table for us.
And now I have to follow up. No, I'm really happy for the opportunity here to get into these questions. I was a comrade of a co-thinker. Last time we did this, it was in the pouring rain during the U Chicago. I was in encampment, so I'm happy to be doing this indoors. And I think through the course of this panel, we'll see me develop some of these lines of disagreements. I think I have a pretty different view than Anita of what the socialist process is. And then before getting into the I have a tremendous amount of respect for her work in being willing to confront imperialist blockades, tell the truth, do journalism in the face of censorship. So happy to be here with this comment as well. I do think I have a view of the Islamic Republic of Iran as a reactionary bourgeois state that was born, on the backs and blood of thousands of revolutionaries, including socialists and communists, right? And continues to employ methods of repression and torture against the more progressive forces within that government. That being said, I want this country to fucking lose this war and every other war. So let's just do that. And I want to start here because I think as we deal with this question of continuity and rupture, it's important. Like Wale used the term of the build. And every president of my lifetime, which is like Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, fucking Biden, every one of these people, and I mean this with no hyperbole, is basically like a Hitler-level monster, morally and politically, right? That's the country we live in. So when we're dealing with the question, it's like when we talk about there's differences in their policies, we're not talking about is one better or worse, right? We're just talking about like how are they confronting the problems of empire. And we can go back and talk about like all of the Sudanese children that Bill Clinton fucking killed by bombing one of the 2 pharmaceutical plants in that country, right? All of the Yemeni people that died under Barack Obama when the US and Saudi Arabia waged a war of aggression against that country. Since kind of World War II, right, it's just the very briefest of history, but since World War II, the US kind of took over for the British Empire. It's like, we're the top dog, we're the #1 imperialist power, and there was a kind of a sense of not just we have to dominate the world for our own purposes, but itself. So we have to kind of ensure the smooth flow of the entire world capitalist system, right? So it's not that like there's this kind of like silly economist view of like, well, every war directly profits some capitalist in the US. That's probably true, but that's not the driving force of every war and every intervention, right? It's that the US has to discipline states that step out of line of the world system, ensure the smooth flow of commodities, oil, right? And I think what Trump, season one of Trump and this kind of new season represents is this kind of idea of certain parts of the US bourgeoisie being like, wait, why do we have to do that for the whole world system? Why can't we let shit go crazy, right? And I think like one of the things you hear from other people about is like you see things like in the national security strategy, it's like, well, China can be powerful, Russia can be powerful, we don't really give a shit. And Trump personally doesn't seem to care that much about the Ukraine war, right? And yet, it's still happening. And the biggest danger with Trump, I think, is to treat him like as if he's an irrational actor, and not as somebody who represents serious thinking about how to uphold the interests of the whole ruling class. So like with the Ukraine war, right? He's like, yeah, maybe we'll win it, maybe we'll not, we don't really care. But also we're gonna make the Europeans start buying more weaponry from us. So we are going to figure out how to make this more profitable for us. So I do want to argue that there is a kind of rupture here, where, and it's been said by people, like, anybody who wants to talk about the rules-based international order after fucking Gaza, like, I don't want to fucking hear it ever, right? But Trump is people seem to just have completely disregarded that. I think the other aspect is that there is this kind of revanchist social base that's generated from Trumpism that loves these images that Molly was showing of Bavino fucking assaulting immigrants, right? Like, there's an appeal, and I may be using this word wrong, but like, there's a kind of like libidinal appeal of like, any country that's ever thumbed its nose at the US, we're gonna go get it now. Like, your reactionary idiot father still is mad about Iran from the 80s, like, we're gonna go get them. Oh, Cuba is still declaring itself independent, we're gonna go get them. And that has this kind of like, there's a psychological component that we should deal with.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Marwa. Thank you, Michael. So this next question is for Anita specifically. So like, I guess in the context of this, like the waning or the withdrawal of the international rules-based order, which we know is really like pretty language for like this really colonial order. There wasn't really a post-colonial order because all that happened in the post-colonial period was the European powers withdrew, but they leave in all the states across the world the same bureaucracies, the same militias, the same infrastructure, borders that they had set up. And then you get this international order, rules-based order to sort of like give that pretty language and legitimize it, internalize sort of the status quo that the European powers established, right? And a big machine or like factor in all of this is the mainstream media. We also see in this post-colonial period the explosion of mass media and mainstream media, and that like is no coincidence. That comes up to legitimize and to give like legitimacy and consent to this international rules-based order, which is really colonialism with pretty, you know, appendages and everything. So I guess the question is, how has mainstream media coverage shaped public understanding of US wars, conflicts, acts of aggression, and what do you think is most misunderstood or even deliberately obscured? That's a big part of it, when they're trying to obscure what's really going on.
I think to briefly add to its commentary regarding the liberal rules-based order is that this is also something that emerged after World War II. And there were people like FDR who became very cognizant quickly that there needed, you couldn't have the permanency of war. Although this is a fundamental component of the world system, there needed to be sort of this false perceived peacetime period. And so that's why I think really there's this important arm of media, but also more broadly cultural production, and how that really sways a lot of public opinion over what happens really on the global stage. To sort of answer your question, I actually want to take us across the Atlantic because I think it's useful. And as internationalists, we know that the media warfare is something that's situated globally. I think immediately He's German, and he's actually the first EU citizen that lives in the EU with extrajudicial sanctions. He's unable to access any of his bank accounts. He's unable to work. It's essentially a socioeconomic death sentence. And we really need to understand it that way because it's akin to when, for example, we look at a place like Cuba that is also sanctioned, but it's something that it's a situation where something or someone is strangled completely and totally. This is not the first person in the European Union that has faced these individual sanctions. And actually, I think that it's very plausible that for many people involved in cultural production, people involved in journalist work here in the United States, that this is something that could be looming too. I say this because also there is this porosity when it is related to what is legal and what is not legal. And when is it convenient for the state to really identify somebody as a terrorist? This is, we see very evidently, right, that there really is no semblance of justice, especially not here in sort of the Euro-American hemisphere. When we see this onset continuation of the genocide against Gaza, we see the perpetuation, countless war crimes, and yet there's no repercussion in the field of international law. But it's because international law, again, was not created for the means of actually perpetuating any mode of justice. Bringing it back to current times and here in the United States, I also wanted to bring up a case that carried out in 2017 in Laredo, Texas. There was the arrest of baseball local journalist Patricia Villarreal, and her only felony was that she asked government employees for non-public info. I mean, it's ridiculous because this is really essentially the job of any journalist is to do some kind of investigative work. Actually, they tried to criminalize her because she asked a cop about two local tragedies, one being a suicide and another being a car wreck. This case, although totally seen as phony and lousy, is actually set the precedent for what was just released this week. The Pentagon released a statement saying that they are no longer allowing journalists to ask questions that are deemed as unauthorized. And we all know here in this room that the United States obviously also operates on a model of monopoly capitalism. We see this really well within mainstream media. Just this month, Oracle co-founder and Trump ally Larry Ellison, who is CEO of Paramount Skydance, is in this major acquisition of CNN parent Warner Bros. And it's really quite shocking because you'll go ahead, and even if, I think for a lot of people that are involved in independent journalism, we are still subject to using certain, platforms like Meta or X. But funnily enough, there was also a recent statement by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth calling out CNN, a CNN report, mind you. I don't think any of us here are really taking to heart what CNN is airing on TV, but saying, they had this patently ridiculous statement because they had reported that the Trump administration had underestimated its risk to oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump himself has also threatened to take certain mainstream media platforms or channels, off of the FCC, depending on their coverage of the Iran war, or more appropriately said, the Ramadan war. So I think it's very evident that there's this confluence between capital and its sort of insatiable accumulation and the interest of truly a elite that will go at any way, any form to achieve that. Doesn't matter what laws are placed, those will easily be disregarded. So I think for a lot of us that are involved in independent cultural vigil for Ayatollah Khamenei and all markers of U.S. imperialism. And I posted my video, and I've never had this happen on a tweet before, but it said visibility limited, and they didn't let anybody else, they blocked it from it being retweeted, from it being shared. So we have to also think creatively about how we can maneuver this massive censorship, right? Many platforms accounts are oftentimes shut down because of their coverage. I mean, the first person that I mentioned who is sanctioned, the first EU citizen living in the EU who is sanctioned, part of the justification for his sanctioning was because of red media's coverage of Palestine. And they made a lousy claim that, he's receiving Russian assets, Russian money. There's no proof. There's no proof. So I really think that, we're seeing at least, whether it's here or even elsewhere, right, the reinvigorating of the Espionage Act of 1917. And these can have really serious consequences, especially because, I think that Trump sort of waves around whatever he'll post out on Truth Social. They'll charge someone with treason, but treason is a charge that comes with a maximum penalty of death under U.S. law. I think that a lot of us that are, dedicated to bringing to light the rampant abuses, it's just a totality of violence that I think till this day I have trouble really finding the adequate vocabulary to describe. I know that we're ready to put out, we're ready to sacrifice quite a lot in order to also carry out this political responsibility, this responsibility that I think we also have to one another and to this collective goal of national liberation, of ending the U.S. imperialist order. So I think we're concluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. This next question is for Michael. So basically, to follow from the first question of the continuity and rupture in the U.S.'s imperial method, looking specifically at developments in Latin America, war in Ukraine, war against Iran, rising tensions in China, all stuff that wasn't started by Trump. What do these arenas reveal about the current strategy of U.S. imperialism? And under Trump, where do we see shifts from the previous strategies of U.S. imperialism, and where do we see continuity?
Thank you. Don't quote me on this. You can quote me on this. I might be wrong, but I believe it was the second night of the Democratic National Convention when a bunch of people in this room were being arrested by Brandon Johnson's CPD, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took the stage to say that Kamala Harris was working tirelessly every day for a ceasefire. You guys remember that moment? And then reported came out, and this was I think it was Dropsite that reported this from the fucking Hebrew language Israeli media, where they interviewed these fucking ghouls who had been in the Netanyahu government. They were like, yeah, the Biden people never called us and said do a ceasefire. The whole period of Biden was this kind of weird, we're going to restore things back to the pre-Clintonian era of the Democratic Party internationalism, and it all fucking crumbled, right? And what were the Biden people trying to do? Contain China, contain Russia, contain Latin America. None of it was successful, right? And that's what we're back to, you have to treat Trump as a rational actor, even though he wants to present himself as something fucking crazy. There is continuity in the sense that they're imperialists. They don't seem to be opposed, they need to be fucking overthrown, right? We need a fucking revolution. I have that in my notes. Say we need a revolution, but we need a fucking revolution. That's one thing. But I think the Trump people have this kind of more coalitional approach than the Biden people can bring in there's a Marco Rubio tweet where it's Biden is bringing in all of these East Coast elites to manage American decline. Broken clock, right? the Trump people have this kind of like demented united front. When you think about like Pete Hegseth being this like fucking free crusader, and his pastor is threatening to kill that Gulf Coast Democrat in Texas, and who's that fucking loser who's the ambassador to Israel? Huckabee, right? It's like just this it's like an unhinged Christian Zionist, right? Who thinks Israel has the right to control not just occupy Palestine, but basically the entire region. And then you have like, fucking Gusano, Frank, Marco Rubio, you have all of these people who all get their turn, right? To kind of see what works. So there's this kind of like element of we don't have a solution for these crises that are plaguing our empire. So instead of like slowly terminally managing to decline a la Biden, let's just try all this stuff and see what happens. And I think within that you see there's a comfort that the Trump people have with essentially outsourcing the tasks of U.S. imperialism. There have always been these kind of like reactionary subalterns willing to do whatever the U.S. did. You see all throughout the 80s and the 90s, anytime there was like legislation blocking like the sales of arms to places like Nicaragua or South Africa, Israel's like, no, we got you, bro. We can still get those arms there. So there's always been these countries that have done the bidding of U.S. imperialism, and I think the Trump people are much more comfortable with like, we don't have a solution for the Middle East, so like we could do a little bit of greater Israel. That's like what's happening in Syria right now, where it's like, oh yeah, we have like the fucking ISIS guy sort of running the government. The country's increasingly occupied by Israel, right? That seems to be the strategy in Lebanon too. That's not like U.S. colonialism, right? This is sort of like, and we will contain all of these countries that we don't care for all of these reasons by letting the Israelis do it. So I think that's some of where the strategy is here.
Thank you very much, Michael. So this next question is for Arwa. Like, I guess like with like as you were discussing earlier, the sort of waning of like the U.S. dominance over the world. Where do you see how like mid-sized countries fit into this world system? For example, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Gulf states, what have you. And what does this behavior also tell us about the structure of power internationally?
It's a very big question. I don't have a grand theory for how the medium-sized countries as a whole fit in the world system, but I do think they occupy a deeply contradictory role. I think that is a grand theory, I don't know. But I think it's clear that they're trying to navigate their way in a shifting political landscape and towing the U.S. line, depending on the state, but also trying to form other countervailing alliances that seem beneficial. And I do think there's a lot of particularities to attend to, such as the historical relationship of particular countries with Western imperialism, the domestic contradictions, the regional role these places occupy. So for example, in the case of Pakistan, we have a historic military relationship with the U.S. and this military intelligence has been employed historically in various parts of the world whenever needed, such as during the Gulf War, and that's an important backdrop to the current role that Pakistan is trying to occupy now in sort of mediating between Iran Western imperialism is, I believe, the principal contradiction that fundamentally shapes the landscape within which these countries operate.
Great, thank you very much, Alma. So now I guess I'm going to shift the questions more into rather than what's going on with the general model of U.S. imperialism under Trump, into specifically, repression of resistance. So this question is for, I guess, everyone on the panel. What shifts has Trump made in repressing resistance? How did it look before Trump, and what new methods have appeared, what shifts what does that look like?
I think one thing to take note of, and part of it has to do, I think, with the Trump administration. They've had massive investments, for example, in AI, and these technologies are used, these same technologies were used, Claude was used to coordinate and facilitate the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, and also these same technologies have been utilized to essentially carpet bomb Iran. With that being said, these same technologies now sort of battling with one another, Claude versus OpenAI, and we also have Google, all of whom have their deep and I would say further deepening relationships with the U.S. military. These same technologies are what we're now confronting as organizers, as journalists, as anti-imperialists as a whole. And it's something that we really should be taking note of in terms of escalation of violence and repression. I think that what we're seeing on a global scale, right? I don't know if some of you saw headlines just last week. For as many criticisms as I do have of Colombian President Gustavo Petro, he was also recently hit with narco-terrorist charges, completely unfounded by all means. And granted, as a side note, I might just add, perhaps he sort of facilitated this for himself, considering how he essentially really abandoned Maduro in different iterations throughout his four-year administration, but I digress. These escalations and sort of using, extrajudicial law are something that also all of us here are keenly subject to. And so I think that, we see this also with the escalations in terms of repression and ICE protests, as the previous panel delved into more detail about. And I really do think that these things will only worsen. And so we need to also find ways to, one, I think, utilize technologies to survey, where there are certain, police centers or ICE centers in order to protect ourselves, to protect our communities. Also, knowing what is sort of our narrative, right? Or how do we communicate certain events? I think we need to be really responsible with that. I really felt this quite strongly, especially being, in Cuba for a week, and there being a varying range of opinions, some of which, I'll be honest, really frustrated me, but I think that we have to be really principled in the ways in which we engage in discourse, whether that's internal or external, because a lot of things can be used against us, and I think more than ever we need to be, as united as possible, and I think it's very difficult in the Western left, especially in the United States. As sort of a personal anecdote, that's sort of why I left the United States for many years, and I just reported, and I was living in Venezuela or Nicaragua for seven because I felt, frustrated. But I think that we can wade through these contradictions adequately if we really can analyze and engage in deep study to see, where is the deepening of crisis occurring and where are our weaknesses.
Already said a lot of what I was going to say, but I'll just add and say that, of course, there's nothing new. I mean, there is something new about the repression, but that's sort of, going back to what Michael said. think is important also because it sort of makes clearer the link between sort of what's happening abroad, the geopolitics, with regards to Palestine, Iran, and so on, and the domestic repression. Another thing I want to mention, which we all, we have been kind of talking about, is the brazenness of this repression, right? And the shift in imperial discourse that we've talked about. I think it can be said to be mirrored in some ways in also the domestic sphere, where there isn't as much of an attempt to really occlude things, to mystify them, to give them a nice cover. But there's a very sort of overt appeal to the most kind of revanchist kind of discourse, and I think that poses interesting and very important challenges in terms of thinking about anti-imperialist resistance. Is this an opening for more powerful agitation, or does this brazenness also make anti-imperialist resistance harder? Those are some of the things we can talk about.
Yeah, those were two great answers, so I'll try to be brief. I remember a comrade and I were out flyering around our election campaign of Votes for Genocide, this pledge around people voting against supports the genocide. We're on a college campus. This is like October of 2024, and this young woman comes up to us and she's like, Trump's gonna get elected and you're gonna go to jail. And he's like, I just got out of jail protesting Palestine. And what are you talking about? So I think, like, yes, the deep continuity in terms of, like, this is a fucking ruling class of bourgeois dictatorship. They will repress, they will crack down, they will censor, right? At the same time, we're seeing all of the lawfare against, or assassinations in the case of Iran, the lawfare assassinations against sovereign leaders, the weaponization of the immigration system. These are new things. I think in some ways, the traditional way, the Biden way, is more comprehensive, right? Instead of going after like a handful of students, you saw that they could effectively shift things. Like, it was under Biden, and nobody seems to fucking remember this, that an entire, like, that Solidarity House, the Potential Prisoner Solidarity Network, was banned in the United States and Canada for doing explicitly First Amendment activities, right? And that's like, it's a shame to this day that that's not something that's brought up more and protested more and resisted more, right? And it wasn't even a court case. Whereas, like, because of the sort of like grifter nature of the Trump government, they got these like kind of fucking morons working for them. And that's not to say they're not morons who will murder people on the streets, but a lot of their cases will not hold up in courts. And we still have to deal with the fact of no matter how fucking woke or progressive or perceived by our local mayor is, like, in every instance, from Brandon Johnson to fucking Karen Bass to, you all know who's in fucking New York now, they will deploy their police against you if you protest for Palestine. There's a member behind enemy lines in New York who went to jail protesting against the abduction of Maduro for using a megaphone. It's like, okay, Mr. Mayor, okay, DJ Barlow, like, you can kidnap the president of a sovereign nation and put him in your city, and you're going to complain, but the likely you're still going to collaborate with that. But if you use a megaphone to protest that, you can go to jail. So it's not to downplay the kind of like what happened with Trump and people being attacked by Trump directly, but it needs to indicate that, like, we have to deal with repression as it's coming down, no matter who's bringing it down, right? There's I think the Arizona Congress has a contradiction. This woman, Sandra Infante, is a mother in a little village in Chicago who has fucking felony charges for protesting ICE in Chicago, right? It's like the state's attorney, the one version of the DA. It's like, you know, she's a Democrat, she's reform-minded, blah, 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 and yet she's trying to put a mother in prison for protesting the ICE raids that she's against.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Aminta. Thank you, Roro. So, I guess to sort of jump off of that, what does this shift mean for us anti-imperialists and those intent on fighting U.S. imperialism and putting a stop to it under Trump?
We need to have courage. We need to stop being afraid. putting name to the crises that we're observing, saying out loud, this is war. And honestly, since the beginning of January, I really came to this conclusion that we're in the beginning phase of a third world war. At least that's what the United States is vying for. And we see that, I felt this so deeply, like when I was in Colombia, working in Bogota, and then the next night, Caracas gets bombed, and in my head, I was like, oh my God, I was supposed to literally go there in a week. And I felt this tremendous panic, and the people that I was working with in Bogota also did as well. But this iteration of, this third world war is also seen, in the Arab-Iranian region. It's also seen in the ways in which the global north wants to attack the lines of the Sahel states, and it's also seen in the mechanisms used to strengthen Pacific Command, for example. All of these things are deeply entrenched, and these are also the same mechanisms, the same kind of violence that is used to oppress internally colonized people here in the global north as well. The same internally colonized people that are used as fodder for what I could deem as a migrant genocide. So, what do we do? What do we need to do? I think also we need to be paying attention to this more recent Prairie Land case. Maybe some of you have read about this. I believe it's 8 or 9 organizers in Texas that are facing up to 15 years in jail, completely unfounded. It's ludicrous. It's insane. And yet the Trump administration is also using this in order to sort of rewrite certain laws and rules, so that if you just wear all black and protest, then you can be deemed as a domestic terrorist. And I also want to, we need to know, and I felt this especially hearing Jackie speak, and I say this, thinking about my other comrades on the front lines, and I'll even say this, a different moment in my life, many years ago, when, they tried to put a lousy domestic terrorist charge on me for my organizing against the sanctions campaign, and this was many years ago, and they tried to say that Juan Guaido was interim president. It was just total bullshit, but they'll do anything that they can. So that means actually we have to fight back, and we have to fight back 10 times harder, 100 times harder. Know that we are not afraid that for every one of us that they take out, there's 10 of us behind. And I really feel, I felt this especially throughout March, and seeing the Iranian resistance and just their tremendous courage, and also, just their message to the world, where we will not back down. And we do not care how many threats you try to impose upon us, we will get justice. And justice does mean that we have to be, in this mode of military defense, right? It's again, imperialism demands permanent war. So we need to understand that concretely. You need to feel that in your heart, you need to feel it in your bones, and know what is it that you have to do in order to really, really fight back.
I completely agree. I think given these shifts we've talked about in terms of repression, I think the course of action is to just be ready to take risks. I mean, even more ready than before, right? And I had some experience with seeing the student organizing around Palestine, the encampments, I mean, there was a lot of stuff that was very admirable and new in terms of just student organizing works on U.S. campuses. It was something that was very sort of refreshing to see, but at the same time, it was also, from my experience at the University of Chicago, you could really sort of see the penetration of the neoliberal kind of itemization, the therapy speak that's invaded political spaces, and the overall subjectivization of politics. challenge is to betray that complacency, which is the product of being here, so protected, right? I think the fact that this war has had relatively little effect on the daily lives of Americans is a testament to sort of obviously the might of the U.S. empire, right? And also it's a challenge when it comes to anti-imperialist resistance, right? Because Americans are so used to being sort of shut out from the world, to being complacent, and because they often don't have to pay the cost, right? And think they can just sort of go about their daily lives while other countries are being bombed and millions of people under the boot of U.S. imperialism. So I think there are particular challenges when it comes to resistance within the belly of the beast, and I do think as the war continues and perhaps the cost becomes more visible, we might enter a more overt state of crisis, which might also be a chance for anti-imperialist agitation. And I guess one thing that's interesting to note is, as you would expect that as the U.S. imperial discourse becomes more brazen, the repression becomes more overt domestically as well, you might think that there would be, that somehow resistance would become easier, but it seems like it's becoming harder, right? And I think that's a question we should think about.
Yeah, I think when we're thinking about this question of repression and what's our responsibility, I think, like, where the fuck were the protests for the Perimeter defendants? I know there were some, right? But, like, where the fuck were they, right? Like, where were the protests for the banning of Samadou? Where were the protests in support of the Palestine Action hunger strikers in the UK, right? Like, where are the protests in support of the Home Rule 5, right? Like, and this is a question that we have to ask ourselves as anti-imperialists, right? And a question that we have to, like, name some fucking names here. And then, like, there are a lot of people who are like, we are in control of the protest movement, we can bring people out on the streets. We're like, we are not going to touch those things because they're maybe less popular, or they're maybe going to get us in trouble with, like, our union buddies, or the mayor, or whatever, right? Like, during the ICE occupation of Chicago, we were waiting for a source with actual institutional power to do something, right? Chicago has one of the most, like, well-known progressive teachers unions in the country, right? They've been sending out emails about, we want to do a one-day strike on May Day, and also call the mayor to tell us to give us the day off, so that's not a strike, right? I'm not agreeing that, like, I don't think that counts as a strike, because the mayor gets a day off. And it's like, you were one of the people with the institutional power in this city. You could have said, we're going to shut down the schools until fucking ICE leaves, so they can't come terrorize our children. That's actual institutional power, and they fucking blinked at that moment, and now they want to do this performative Mayday shit. It's like, there are people who could say, like, we are going to stop business as usual if you lock up the Perimeter defendants, right? Like, I think about almost every day the young people in Palestine Action in the UK, and we have this whole other panel that's going to deal with some of these questions, who were like, I am willing to seriously harm, if not in my life, to demand my right for a trial, because actually shutting down the Element facility was morally and politically justified. And I think we really failed as human beings and as anti-imperialists in not building up more support for those people, right? And so I think we do have to confront both the fact that, like, we have not developed institutionally, organizationally, and politically, and forgive me, spiritually, right, the capacity to have those 10 people behind every one person. We're trying to, that's what Behind Enemy Lines existed to do. And I also think we have to name, like this is the modus operandi of groups like FRSL, the PSL, the USPCN, where it's like, we are going to only ever protest safely behind police lines, and if you try to do something else, we will work with the fucking police to make sure you cannot, right? We have to drive those fucking snakes out once and for all.
Very nicely put. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Arwa, and Anita. So now we'll get to the end of this before we wrap up and go on to audience Q&A. So I guess finally to tie, our struggle here in the US to the rest of the world, what sources of resistance should we look to internationally for inspiration and solidarity, be it currently ongoing, even historically maybe? So, yeah.
Perhaps I'm biased, but I immediately always look towards Nicaragua as a tremendous source of inspiration. And part of this is also because I really feel that Nicaragua is not commonly spoken about in not only the US or even European left, but also in Latin America. I was so surprised and shocked that, for example, recently in the flotilla to Cuba, I was only one of two Nicaraguans there. And we both didn't live in the country. This needs to change. And why? We look at Nicaragua, who was able to mitigate, one, the Contra War of the 80s, to survive, still have a revolution survive afterwards, even with tremendous U.S. interference in the 90s, especially the establishment of unipolarity within the world system, to be able to take your country back, to be able to reverse the treacherous effects that were caused by 17 years of neoliberal governance, to be able to have almost 100% food sovereignty, agroecological sovereignty, working with communes. These things are very important and pertinent, and I think that we need to be paying more attention to agrarian struggles, even for those of us that live in metropoles, because it really tells us a lot. When you understand your territory, it makes you a better organizer, and it makes you better, almost in a way like scientist, right? Trying to understand, who is present, who are you working with, and what are the contradictions that are present as well. So I'll start with that. I also think that it's important for us to look to, for example, the alliances with Sahel states, right? Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. They've been able to really just kick out the French, and this is a tremendous success. And the EU, they're still trying to apply their dirty hands onto the region. Still trying to implement the CFA franc system, for example, that subjects these states and many other states in Africa to a new colonial component, but really structures it so that it experiences underdevelopment. But these are places that we should be paying tremendous importance to. There's a wealth of knowledge, I think, between Marxist theories from Africa, Aragon, and regional Latin America that really deserve to be rescued. I mean, Asia as well too. I guess I'll also conclude it. There's so many examples. There's really a wealth of examples, and it's so important for us to rescue and have a sense of historical memory. I would also think that I think for me, what has really been giving me a lot of hope, and it's probably very obvious because I keep mentioning it, but it's the axis of resistance currently. We need to have our full 100, our full support to the axis of resistance, to the IRGC, to Hamas, to Hezbollah. They try to demonize even people that are fighting for their national sovereignty and national liberation. That is what's really going to actually take away the colonial component that the Arab-Iranian region still is subject to. There's truly so many examples, but I think I'll conclude it there. Thank you.
I'll just briefly add to those wonderful comments, and I completely agree. I think we need to take a principled stance against imperialism first and foremost, and for national liberation without qualifications or conditions. That's number one, I think. In addition to all that was mentioned, we can take inspiration from so many people, but especially from Palestine, right? And Palestine really represents a singular kind of resistance to this U.S.-Israeli death machine, the global capitalist system, and as people who are situated in the belly of the beast, I think we need to confront sort of our own position in this wide modern machinery of death and take advantage of our position and what we can do here to stop this machinery from destroying so many lives and trampling other nations' sovereignty and just spreading death and destruction around the world. And even within this country, we should take a look at and gain inspiration from a lot of the anti-war resistance during the Vietnam War, right? And Black Panthers, and there's a lot of things from US's own history that we need to sort of recover from this historical amnesia that afflicts a lot of leftist organizing and work against US imperialism.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think my kind of like frustrated sassy comment is like, I wish more people were taking inspiration and courageous action from the Palestinian resistance than making that their fucking profile picture or like dressing up as them or like waving the flag at protests. Like, that's cool. What are you going to do about it? If we had a fucking king of the courage, if we had pinkies for the courage of the Palestinian resistance, we'd be in a very different fucking place. I think there's an obligation and a strategic opportunity to connect up with comrades in other English-speaking countries. There's historic ties between our ruling classes, Canada, the UK, Australia, where there's been a lot of repression against pro-Palestinian speech. I think that's an opportunity we should figure out how to pursue, literally as Kennedy lines and also generally as comrades here. For me, I think the two most important revolutionary movements in the world today, which are both facing very immense challenges, are in India and the Philippines, where there's now a protracted people's wars happening, where they're in very, very difficult situations, able to develop new forms of popular power and waging armed struggle against their own governments, both of which are backed by the US in various ways. And I think to that point, for me, a great source of inspiration is the Chinese Revolution in its social period from 1949 to 1976. Since I put my bookseller hat on, there's a book I'll plug called Continuing the Revolution After the Revolution. That's a new book talking about what that experience was for the rest of people.
Thank you very much, Anita. Thank you very much, Arwa. Thank you very much, Michael. We'll cut straight into the audience Q&A. Do any of you guys have any questions for our wonderful panelists? We can start with you.
I wanted to pick up on something Michael said much earlier in the discussion, which is that it seems as though rather than managing the decline of capitalism in the US, Trump and his administration are basically throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. But historically, that's been how capitalism has revitalized itself over and over. Neoliberalism wasn't a plan, it was what ended up working through the crisis of the New Deal and progressivism, free market capitalism before that. If we can call what Trump represents post-neoliberalism, just to give it a category, is Marxism enough to keep up with changes in the post-neoliberal world? If you are sympathetic to Marxism, I guess. If so, what does Marxism provide us beyond the liberal critique of imperialism, that it's bad state policy because it's not in the interest of the people or something like that, or the pacifist one that war should just be opposed on principle? If Marxism isn't adequate to the present, what is limited about it? And I really hope that all panelists can answer this.
Marxism works for Marxists.
Sorry, I didn't completely understand the question. I mean, Marxism obviously works. I mean, Marxist theory, I think that's all of our analyses kind of are based in that. I just assumed. But in terms of, yeah, so I don't know if I'm going to rephrase your question. I'm not sure I understood it.
What does Marxism allow us to say when we're also seeing that the world is changing? What is like Marxist about it, and what is more than an un-Marxist critique of imperialism?
Yeah, I think I can think of a lot of Marxist approaches to So a lot of liberal critiques of imperialism would focus on imperialism as a policy, not as a structure, right? I mean, that's the classic sort of Lenin's critique of Hobson, right? J.A. Hobson, in the context of Scramble for Africa. And Hobson's thesis was that the British imperial policy was basically just a function of financiers taking over government, the British government's policies, and I think that's mirrored in some of the discourse that looks at US's relationship with Israel solely through the perspective of Israel lobby's influence, right? Which is divorced from the geopolitical considerations, the actual interests of Western capital in the Middle East, right? So when I think of Marxist approaches to imperialism, I think about a systemic analysis, right? That tries to grasp the contradictions in the global capitalist system, right? I think a lot of left actually takes un-Marxist approaches to imperialism. I think that's very evident, for instance, in the statements put out by a lot of the trade unions, right? The AFL-CIO, but even the more respected unions as well, right? Where they criticize US's actions in Iran as just sort of in a sort of generic sense of like this is these actions are driven by Trump's crazy policies, right? And again, divorced from the US's long-standing interests in the region, which are tied to the global accumulation of capital, right? Yeah.
I think Marxism is still very incredibly relevant, especially when we're looking at any kinds of resistance to the underdevelopment that the global south has been subject to. The nation states that have been able to adopt a revolutionary character, Marxism, where they're able to also foster innovative internal production, right? Where they're also able to contend with the previous colonial modes of capitalist production that were residues. Mahdi speaks about this more directly in the Arab world. However, I do think that we can even take some of this theory and even apply to Latin America, and sort of just the ways that people make sense of themselves as political actors, make sense of themselves in terms of what does it mean to actually construct a place where you have national sovereignty, where you actually have the capacity to have dignity as a worker. I think also important components that I find personally very relevant in my own work and research. I think I'm always sort of returning to the works of Walter Rodney, for example. I mean, his first chapter alone in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, I think, is really apt at sort of describing sort of what we were talking about in our conversation earlier today, or earlier in this moment, about sort of this liberal rules-based order, about sort of the establishment of these international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. What is useful about Marxism is that it provides this tool of historical materialism. And so it really is a scientific means of trying to understand the contradictions, as you previously mentioned, that are present. And those contradictions are always changing. Just to sort of conclude, I think one of the more interesting ways in which I think Marxist theory is being applied to right now is we're thinking through how imperialist war is still very permanent, but also its strategies are changing. When we're thinking about this idea of do we live in a polycentric world, is a multipolar world really emerging, or is it not? And I think the Marxist framework allows us to also remember sort of what Marx deemed as the sixth great power, which is the people's revolutionary power. And when we're thinking about sort of these transitions in geopolitics and how we can make sense of different crises, like we have a massive labor reserve of people in the global south. This is also what creates sort of this migration. And migration is sort of this like economic form of imperialism too. This coupled with also more accelerated crises within the market, so on and so forth, the permanency of war, not as abstractions, right? They're concrete events that can be traced back, and we can theorize. Really, I think the tool is like, I'll just conclude with this. One of my favorite Marxist political economists, when he talks about delinking and like thinking about the potentialities of delinking from southern countries being able to remove themselves from the violence, right? The accumulation, the dispossession imposed by the global north, and how can they actually establish sovereignty on an economic realm? All of these things are really important and necessary. And I think that to make sense of ourselves as political beings, having a strong relation with political economy, actually it rules. It's really helpful, and more people should probably be more sympathetic to it. So.
Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you to the panel for the conversation today. It's going to be great. So I first became politicized in the post-9/11 period to build up to the Iraq wars. And through that, we saw things like the Patriot Act, which normalized much of the mass state surveillance and repression. And we can still see a lot of that in Israel today. In fact, it's much more developed and whatnot. So my question is like, going through that, having been through that experience, we participated in arguing some of the largest demonstrations in decades ago. And there were millions of people in the streets, both in the U.S. and globally. It was an enormous period at that time. Looking back at that, what are some of the lessons we can wrench, both in terms of like, what can we sum up from that that's applicable to today that we can learn from? What were the shortcomings of that? And what are the things we need to learn and to build off of in terms of building mass movement against imperialism today?
Who's this question for?
This is really for the panel. Okay, so
I think, a few years before the Patriot Act was established and implemented, right, we really saw again this emergence of a unipolar world. We had, before, right, the fall of the Soviet Union, and this really transformed sort of escape of the geopolitical arena. So much so that I think that culturally, right, there was sort of this understanding, especially in the West, that, any projects of alternative development, socialist development were nullified. Although this wasn't true, right, and we had Cuba, going through the special period of the 90s and so on and so forth. I think at the turn of the century, what we really see is this sort of cultural apparatus that limits how people were conceptualizing sort of these changes internationally. In terms of mass surveillance, I think that there's still sort of the remnants of the Patriot Act and how that is utilized against us as organizers, as journalists. So I think I'm someone that I don't know if I'm the best suited to answer your question, but right now I think it's really interesting that there's sort of more questions or thoughts about like polycenterism and if that's something that's possible, which I think that when the Patriot Act was established maybe wasn't so present, and so I think that this can maybe give us different kinds of tools to understand that. Maybe some of the other panelists can have a more detailed perspective.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think on this question really quickly, Patriot Act and electronic surveillance, I think it argues for doing things like we're doing here, like not talking to each other through technologies that are ruled by our fucking enemies, right? But like finding ways to come together in person and have this discussion and debate. And I think on the question of the post 9/11, Islamophobia, and repression. I hope everybody can come back tomorrow for the panel on repression. I'm staring away. I'm sorry, but come back and hear what she has to say. They never heard her speech. It's incredible. So be there for that panel. Yeah, I think I agree with some of the geopolitical stuff I'm going to lay out. I'm going to again do the thing. I'm sorry, I'm speaking after you. I'm like, I disagree with this thing you didn't do, but come back next year for everybody on what socialism is. Like, I think what collapsed in the Soviet Union was a kind of like distorted social imperialist system that had been developed through the kind of Khrushchev era and beyond. That's something we can discuss later or on the side. I think on the Iraq question, how many people were like alive and aware in the early 2000s? Okay. I mean, right, so you had this massive wave of just like unhinged jingoism, right, happening throughout the country in the immediate wave of 9/11. Like let me tell the story, I'm a new slur. It's my story. You can be mad at me. I was in high school right when 9/11 happened, and I was sort of like, well, this is bad, when I do war, that's bad. I went into school the next day, and all the kids from like the football team were like giving people like flag ribbons to wear. And I was like, I'm not gonna wear a flag ribbon because I had enough consciousness to be like, that flag means war. And this kid from like the football team or whatever the fuck looks me in the eye and he says, why aren't you gay? Did he use the slur? It's like, so that was like the attitude, right, across the whole kind of country. And then like a year and a half later, there was this kind of bursting of the dam, and there were like millions and millions and millions and millions of people protesting the Iraq War, and there was like this moment of hope, right? And there was a similar kind of like what was Wally's term, Lib Pill people being like, oh, this president's crazy, we gotta get rid of him, blah, blah, blah. And then people think this happened with regards to Obama, but the history is wrong. This was fucking John Kerry, became the Democratic nominee for president in 2000 and whatever that was, 2004, 2005, right? And he gets up there at the DNC and says, my name is John Kerry and I'm reporting for duty, and does this jaunty little salute, right? And his campaign was premised on being the best candidate to win the war, right? And essentially the entire anti-war movement fell in line with that election. So I think that the lesson there is like, it does not fucking matter who is in office, we have to take a firm anti-imperialist position, right? And I think there were not enough people within the anti-war movement then. There were some people, the people who kind of brought me into political life, communists and anarchists, like, who were trying to do that. But like, we need to be clear on our anti-imperialism, not as a dividing line. Like, if you are not sure you're an anti-imperialist yet, and you want to come fucking protest this Iran war or stand with Palestine, like rock and roll, let's do that, let's struggle about it. But like, we need to do that anti-imperialist education, and then going to the masses and bringing forward people, and we need to bring forward this sense of like, we stand with the people of the fucking world, right? Ellen at this point in her keynote, it's like, yes, it's insane how much this war costs every day, and yes, like, obviously all kinds of things could be happening with that money, but even if this war were putting money in my pocket, I would still oppose it, because they're running people and my sisters and brothers and my people, right? Not the people who run this fucking country.
Do we have time for one more question? All right. Can take you in the back, please.
I really appreciate what's been said thus far. I guess my question goes more towards in the line of like repression. I think what's been attempted murderer is still free and walking the street. So I guess my question there is how can we use, how can we use this, use repression and build people's consciousness against it and mobilize them to get them organized to fight against it, to actually see themselves as capable of fighting back against the system. And that's, sorry, and that's for everybody.
I mean, I'll just say that I guess there's both short-term and long-term amnesia that seems to be part of sort of American society, and I think which is also exacerbated by the by social media, right, which is sort of beholden to sort of a particular topic that comes to dominate our feeds, and then we move on to the next, and there's a kind of amnesia that's sort of built into that very rhythm of a lot of times even of organizing, right? And I think part of what BL does, which I think is excellent, is street teams, right? Which is like going out, talking to people, person-to-person contact, not just through social media, through these anonymous abstract channels, but actually collectively feeling that power, building that power, and sort of doing that through going to the people, right? I think that's very important in spreading this awareness, making things last longer, right, than we're used to with our reliance on social media and all these other things. And I'll let others contribute.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think just briefly, I'm thinking as the question is about our experience defending the people who were arrested and protesting the DNC. And the charges were as heavy as like felony charges, or obviously as like one more to being fucking shot, right? But one of the problems with this question is like when we were, people were arrested and demanded their day in court, and it was like 6, 7, 8 months after the DNC protests had happened, and we were going out talking to people, trying to drum up media attention on these cases. People were like, huh? When was the DNC? It was like people like lose focus, and there's a pace and speed of events, right? And like we need to build up this kind of like mass culture of resistance, right? Where people are like, I am aware of these things happening. If I have some disagreements with a person's politics or their tactics, okay, but whatever. I'm still gonna get their back. I'm still gonna defend them. We'll do things like that where we can struggle these things out. But like where we're gonna defend people and not let people down. If people look at like even further like the history of the Communist Party, right? They initiated this thing called the International Labor Defense. And one of the first things they did was they were communist, obviously the Communist Party, but they provided support for all of these old like IWW anarchists, meaning political prisoners. They made points to raise their cases, to put money on their books, and started to generate a culture so that when people step forward, they know that somebody's going to get their backs.
So yeah, thank you very much again to